Hello and welcome to Thursday in Parliament, our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. On this programme, Labour describes as shameful the government's decision to wind down a scheme allowing vulnerable refugee children into Britain.
Where does it say that instead of the 3,000 that Parliament debated, we will only help a tenth of that number? Where does it say that when we get the chance, we will somehow turn our backs once again?
Egging on their lordships, an SNP MP encourages the House of Lords to delay the Brexit bill.
For us, it's very much a win-win, whatever the outcome is here. So when I say to the lordships, reach for these barricades and take on this government.
And are they really the future? Smart energy meters are criticised for not being very smart.
Last year, The Telegraph reported that over 130,000 smart meters were now operating in this dumb mode as a result of switching.
But first, the government is insisting it's not abandoning vulnerable refugee children, despite winding down its scheme which allows unaccompanied youngsters into the UK. 350 children, mostly from Syria, are to be offered sanctuary under the project. Campaigners had hoped that more than 3,000 youngsters, some of whom have already made their way to mainland Europe, would be accepted. Answering an urgent question in the House of Commons, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd described how the scheme had operated.
Within Europe in 2016, we transferred over 900 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children to the UK. This included more than 750 from France as part of the UK's support for the Calais camp clearance. And I'm proud that as Home Secretary, the UK played such a key role in supporting the French to safely and compassionately close the camp. Yesterday, the government announced that, in accordance with Section 67 of the Immigration Act, we will transfer the specified number of 350 children pursuant to that section who reasonably meet the intention and spirit behind the provision.
She said the scheme was not being closed.
The government has always been clear that we do not want to incentivise perilous journeys to Europe, particularly by the most vulnerable children. That is why children must have arrived in Europe before the 20th of March 2016 to be eligible under Section 67 of the Immigration Act. The Section 67 obligation was accepted on the basis that the measure would not act as a pull factor for children to Europe and that it would be based on local authority capacity. The government has a clear strategy and we believe that this is the right approach.
This week, the government cancelled the Dubs scheme after it had been running for less than 6 months. She said it hasn't closed, but will she confirm what it said in the statement yesterday? Absolutely. That once those 350 children are here, that's it, it is closed. Yeah. Where does it say in the Hansard debate that I have here from our debates on the Dubs amendment that we will only help lone child refugees for 6 months? Where does it say that instead of the 3,000 that Parliament debated, we will only help a tenth of that number? Where does it say that when we get the chance, we will somehow turn our backs once again? It doesn't, because we didn't say that at the time.
She said the Home Secretary had acted shamefully.
And there are still so many children in need of help. She knows there are thousands in Greece in overcrowded accommodation or homeless, or in Italy still at risk of human trafficking, on teenagers in French centres which are being closed down now and they have nowhere left to go. She talked about clearing Calais. They are heading back to Calais, back to Dunkirk, back to the mud, back to the danger, back into the arms of the people traffickers and the smugglers, the exploitation, the abuse, the prostitution rings, and back into the modern slavery that this Parliament and this government has pledged to end.
These are children who need looking after over a period. When we accept them here, it is not job done. It is making sure that we work with local authorities, that we have the right safeguarding in place. And that's why we engage with the local authorities, why we make sure that they have sufficient funds, which we have increased, to look after those young people. I completely reject her attack. The UK has a strong reputation in Europe and internationally for looking after the most vulnerable. That will continue. We have a different approach to where those most vulnerable are. We believe that they are in the region. That's why we've made a pledge to accept 3,000 children from the region, and we are committed to delivering on that.
And how does she live with herself? Leaving thousands of people thousands and members opposite can jeer. How does she live with herself, leaving thousands of children subject to disease, people trafficking, squalor and hopelessness?
She describes how she doubts that the children in France are looked after. But I can say to the Right Honourable Lady, the children who are most vulnerable are the ones in the camps out in Jordan, out in Lebanon. Yes. These are the ones who are really vulnerable. And those are the ones that we are determined to bring over here.
It seems that the government tried to sneak out what they knew would be a very unpopular announcement when they were busy avoiding scrutiny in this House about the Brexit deal. Is this the shape of things to come? And is this what comes of cozying up to President Trump?
I think many in this House have listened to what she said with total disbelief. We cannot understand, given the intensity of the discussion and debate around the ALF dubs, an amendment that was put and accepted by this House, that Home Secretary has come forward with what essentially is a closure of that scheme at a number well below what any of us would have expected. Does she not agree with me that the reality will be that many children across Europe in desperate need will be left with no hope?
I'm glad to hear there's going to be another 150 children coming to the UK under this scheme before it closes. But can the Secretary of State tell the House, is she able to look the 151st child in the eye and say no?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Well, I wonder how the Honourable Lady would feel about the children who are from the region. The children who are in the camps. They're not in France. They're not in Italy. They're the ones in the camps where the conditions are much, much worse. How would she feel about looking them in the eye?
Amber Rudd. Well, the scheme for giving sanctuary to unaccompanied children has always been associated with the name of the 84-year-old Labour peer Lord Dubs. He himself first arrived in Britain from Czechoslovakia in 1938 as part of the Kindertransport fleeing the Nazis. In the Lords, Lord Dubs gave his reaction to the latest developments. He said to him it seemed the scheme was being closed.
My Lords, I must confess I'm slightly puzzled, because if the government says there is a specified number of children, then after that total has been reached, the scheme has been closed. My Lords, it wasn't long ago that I remember the Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary, told me that the government was prepared to accept the amendment. It was on the same day that the then Immigration Minister said to me that the government would accept the letter and the spirit of that amendment. I believe in arbitrarily closing down a scheme without any good reason for doing so. The government is in breach of its own commitments.
My Lords, the scheme is not closed. As the Noble Lord said, we will be accepting up to the limits of 350. But at this point in time, the scheme is not closed. What I think, well, more children will come. The scheme is not closed. What I think we have to appreciate, and I think Noble Lords generally have appreciated, is that the capacity of local authorities is limited. Well, Noble Lords might rubbish that, but the capacity of local authorities is limited. We have relied on their goodwill. It has been an entirely voluntary approach from local authorities. And of course, I would encourage more local authorities to come forward who think that they might have places.
There are many people who have expressed an interest to help, but the government, both to the churches, other faiths, local authorities. I myself know several people who have indicated their willingness to help to a local authority but have had little response back. Obviously, the government is quite disinterested in taking any more children.
My Lords, that is absolutely wrong. Yes, we have had expressions, we have had informal expressions of interest, and I would encourage the Noble Lady, if she has the names of those individuals, the names of those community groups, and the names of those church groups, to please contact us so that we can get matters in train.
Lady Williams. Now, it's not been the best 12 months for the game of football. The England manager had to resign when he was filmed making covert deals behind the backs of Football Association officials. Stories surfaced about about incidents of historical abuse on youngsters by scouts and coaches. And there was the little matter of a humiliating international knockout for the England national team at the hands of Iceland last summer. So is part of the solution for football's varied problems better governance of the sport? The Commons has been holding a special debate.
The Premier League, its primary job is to promote its competition, and it does so brilliantly all around the world. However, it exerts an enormous amount of influence over football because of the vast amount of money that it raises and it funds back into the game. So therefore we do need a strong Premier League, that's good for football, but we need a strong national governing body of football that is ultimately responsible for many of the sporting and ethical decisions that football has to take. It is necessary to reform the structure of the FA board to make the FA more independent, to give it the power to act. We've been calling for this for years. The Select Committee has been calling for it in previous reports. We believe now that legislation is the only way in which this can be delivered. That was the recommendation of the last 3 chairmen of the FA to the Select Committee, to say the FA cannot reform itself, the turkeys won't vote for Christmas, there has to be external pressure and external action through legislation to achieve it. What I'm asking in this debate today is that if the government is unsuccessful in getting reform from the FA, that a bill is prepared to be introduced into the next session of Parliament after the Queen's speech to deliver the reform the FA so badly needs.
Club ownership, safe standing, 20 is plenty, kick-off times, disabled access, tackling homophobia are all issues that need to be addressed by reformed FA, and with more supporter input, I hope that will now happen. I hope this debate will show that we are serious about reform.
In the end, you look at a situation where an ordinary Premier League player in 2 months can earn more than Sheffield City Council can spend on its junior football pitches in a whole year. Yeah. There's something wrong with that. Shows that the wrong balance of money in the game. So if we're going to have that reformed board, it has to be able to divert more money into grassroots football and actually stop the cliff edge between the Premier League and the English Football League as well. But we shouldn't belittle everything the FA does. Great things. It's done really well on the women's game at local level and at professional level. It's tackled racism.
Many fans would want to see for instance, the FA have some more influence over the number of homegrown players that are developed in our league. It's woefully inadequate. We have far too many of these pret-a-porter players that are imported on the basis of the fact that there's so much wealth knocking about in the Premier League that rather than develop and take a chance on a youngster, they buy someone off the peg and bring them in. And we don't impose the rules that should be implied in terms of how those players contribute and add to this game. And many fans would like to see an FA that can deal with issues like that.
What is most shocking, in my view, though, is not that the governance of the FA is in need of fundamental reform. That is a settled point, Mr Speaker, but that the leadership of the FA has been so grossly ineffective in bringing forward these reforms in the face of criticism from the cross-party Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. At best, they are dragging their feet. At worst, they are wilfully failing to act.
We know that the FA are failing to regulate the power of football agents. They have a football agents exam, which I'm told can be passed by an 11-year-old. They're failing to regulate correctly the transfer negotiations, and there is still the potential for a bung culture within those negotiations because the structures aren't right, and so the management below isn't right, and the enforcement below isn't right.
The FA's current model does not, in my opinion, and clearly that of other colleagues, stand up to scrutiny. Reform is therefore required. But I repeat, the governing body has every opportunity to bring that about themselves. And while I believe a vote of no confidence in the FA today is 6 weeks premature, they and other governing bodies should be fully aware that the clock is ticking fast, and failure to reform will lead not just to the withdrawal of public money, but further consideration of legislative, regulatory and financial options to bring about this change needed. If we want to see better governance of football across the world, then let it begin here.
The Commons debate on football. You're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, could the House of Lords frustrate the Brexit process? MPs have called on the government to consider formally recognising a Palestinian state. The suggestion was made during a debate on a backbench motion demanding an immediate halt to the planning and construction of Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Given the investment that we have made in a two-state solution, my question to the Minister is, aside from standing on the touchlines, watching the players on the field and shouting advice, what more can we do whilst our friend and ally pursues a policy on settlements which is bound, so proceeding, to deliver a situation where the two-state solution becomes actually geographically and economically unworkable? He might consider giving effect to this House's instruction that we should recognise the Palestinian state. Now, I have heard my honourable friend say that we can only do this once, and therefore we need to choose the moment where that will make the maximum impact, and I agree with him. But he needs to consider this. It would be truly absurd if we were to delay that recognition till after the point at which the reality of any such Palestinian state could actually be delivered.
So will the Minister agree with me that when the two-state solution that we all support is now under threat like never before, that now is the time to act on that bilateral recognition? We have to ask ourselves, if not now, then when? And if not now, aren't those Palestinians who believe that we talk a good story but we do nothing to end their misery are actually right?
Supporters of Israel argue that settlements are not the sole barrier to peace or indeed the main one.
As supporters of a two-state solution, we should commit ourselves to building trust with and between both Israelis and Palestinians. We should do that in both our words and our actions. In our words, we should seek to avoid emotive language which feeds a narrative of victim and villain. We should recognise and encourage the need for compromise, and we should never fail to acknowledge the complexities of a conflict which has endured for decades and whose roots run deep.
It's often said that Israeli settlements are illegal, but stating this repeatedly does not make it true. The West Bank, and please bear with me because I realise it's quite an inflammatory comment, but bear with me for a moment. The West Bank and Gaza remain, as they have always been, disputed territories under international law. There has never been a Palestinian state, so the territory remains ownerless, and that's a strong argument for some.
I am deeply disappointed that this government continues to fail to recognise the Palestinian state. Now is the time, and I would ask him to give some comment on that. Secondly, what thought has the government put into how it can be that settlement goods can be separated from other Israeli goods? There are many people who do not wish to buy settlement goods, and is the government doing any further work on that? And how can we persuade British companies not to invest in settlement areas? But most importantly, I hope that when President Trump and the Prime Minister Netanyahu visit London later this year, our Prime Minister will have the courage to set out those views in no uncertain terms.
The Foreign Office Minister Tobias Ellwood voiced concern that territory for a Palestinian state was being eroded by settlement building, but he said the Palestinian leadership needed to do more to prevent the incitement of violence.
President Abbas condemned certain aspects of it, but we're still seeing schools and squares being named after terrorists. This is not the confidence-building measures that we need to see. There is no relationship with the Hamas at all. These are the steps that will allow us to move forward so there can be a recognition in the long term of the state of Palestine, but they are not there yet. And a younger generation has given up on their own leadership, choosing instead to try and take a fast track to paradise by grabbing a knife and killing an Israeli soldier. And that is a very terrible state of affairs to be in.
The latest debate on the Palestinian territories. Don't mess about or you'll get abolished. That was reported to be the blunt warning issued to members of the House of Lords on Wednesday night by government supporters, shortly after the moment when the so-called Brexit bill finally cleared the Commons. So could peers delay the whole process of triggering Article 50, the legal means by which the procedure is started for the UK to leave the EU? The Scottish National Party is normally fiercely critical of the Lords, but the SNP's Pete Wishart appeared to be supportive of peers, finding fault with the Brexit bill.
Mr Speaker, the bill now goes on its way down to our friends down the corridor. And what we've seen is that there are unelected friends have been threatened with abolition if they dare mess with this government's bill. I'm sure they're now quaking in their ermine if they don't do their patriotic duty, as the Secretary of State said. Can I just say, I offer nothing other than encouragement to these fine tribunes in ermine who will now pick up the case. For us, it's very much a win-win, whatever the outcome is here. So can I say to the Lordships, reach for these barricades and take on this government.
On the question of the House of Lords has a valued function under our constitutional arrangements in terms of scrutinising and reviewing legislation coming up from the House of Commons, as I'm sure they will do that on the bill we've been debating this week, as they do on every other bill, but that they will also bear in mind the reality of the referendum and the popular mandate that lies behind the Article 50 decision.
Would the Leader of the House accept that this Parliament works because we have two houses, and sometimes the other place doesn't agree with this House and annoys the government? That is no reason whatsoever to threaten it with abolition. Could we have a statement from the Leader of the House confirming that?
The government's position is that we respect completely the constitutional role of the House of Lords, and as I said earlier, the House of Lords itself accepts that as an unelected House, it needs to abide by certain conventions.
David Liddington. Now, how smart is smart metering of gas and electricity? The idea is that your handy smart meter device sends automatic messages to your gas and electricity supplier so you don't need to. No more estimated bills. And you can see how much energy you're actually using. The government is in favour of large-scale introduction of smart meters, but in a debate in Westminster Hall, several MPs had doubts. One spoke about his own experience.
The smart meter was fitted. Now, once a month, I have to go outside and take a photo of my smart meter and send that photo over broadband to the supplier because I don't have connectivity. My smart meter isn't connected to anything because I don't have the mobile phone signal. Now, that is a challenge if we're going to provide 20 million smart meters, or however many we're supplying, it's quite a lot, by 2020. Now, the interesting thing is, I'm the local MP. The local BBC reporter recently emailed me to say that he'd had a smart meter fitted. He has to do exactly the same thing. So it's a bit worrying in terms of winning public support for this. If the local MP and the local BBC presenter actually has smart meters that don't work. Now, clearly, this is a private meeting, so I'm not telling the world that my smart meter doesn't work, but I do enjoy telling the story.
The idea of having complete knowledge of the energy you're consuming is a desirable objective. But we are not doing it in a way that will be appreciated by the consumer and will probably be at a cost to the consumer.
There's a great variety in the meters that are being installed just now. Again, I'll say the ones that I saw at Scottish Gas, we're all singing and all dancing, probably could make your cup of tea for you as well. The meter I've got is far less interactive, and there is a real danger. In fact, we've seen this with a lot of people, that the meter, after a short time, or certainly the display unit, ends up getting tossed in a drawer or a cupboard somewhere.
And a Conservative MP also saw some limitations.
One of these relates to interoperability between suppliers. That is, customers who switch their energy supplier after installation run the risk of losing the meter's smart functionality, depending on who they're switching from and to. It could revert to being a dumb, or perhaps more kindly, a traditional meter. Last year, the Telegraph reported that over 130,000 smart meters were now operating in this dumb mode as a result of switching.
What we are talking about here is an upgrade of a very significant part of our infrastructure, an upgrade of a technology that is 100 years old. An upgrade of a technology at the moment for far too many people means that people are looking at bills where their consumption is estimated. We don't tolerate that in the supermarket. Why on earth should we tolerate it at home in the modern age in 2017? That people should continue, and our system, our energy system, absolutely functional to a smart and prosperous economy should be continuing to be dependent on a technology that is so out of date.
Nick Hurd. And that's it for this programme. Do join me for the Week in Parliament when we analyse the contribution to Parliament made by the Speaker of the Commons, John Bercow. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.